It was supposed to be just another freezing winter night, but then something unimaginable happened. A lone dog, frozen solid in the middle of a snowstorm, with no sign of life. His body was stiff, his fur covered in ice. No one believed he could survive. But just as they were about to bury him, a miracle happened. What brought this dog back from the brink of death? And what shocking truth would soon be uncovered? Stay with us, because this story will leave you speechless. The storm had swallowed the small town in a relentless white shroud, burying roads, trees, and homes under thick layers of snow. The wind howled like a restless beast, rattling window panes and bending skeletal branches. It was the kind of night where most people stayed inside, curled up by the fire, grateful for warmth. But Daniel Carter was not most people. Daniel was a man in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that bore the marks of time and hardship. His once dark hair was now peppered with strands of grey, and his eyes, deep-set and brown, carried a weight that came from witnessing too much suffering. He had spent most of his life working as an animal rescue worker, dedicating himself to saving those that others had abandoned. But after a personal tragedy, he had walked away from it all. Losing his wife to cancer had changed him. Claire had been his anchor, the one who made the world feel softer. When she died, something inside him withered. He left his job, moved to a quieter town, and tried to escape the ghosts of his past. Now he worked as a mechanic in a small auto shop, simple, unremarkable work that kept his hands busy and his mind numb. Tonight, he just wanted to get home to his daughter Lily, who was waiting for him with a warm meal. The drive was treacherous. His truck's tires skidded on the icy road, and the snow came down so thick that his headlights barely cut through the darkness. Then something caught his eye. A strange shape, barely visible beneath the swirling white. At first it looked like just another mound of snow, but as he drew closer his stomach tightened. There was something unnatural about it, an odd shape, rigid and still. Instinct kicked in. Daniel pulled over, the engine humming, as he stepped out into the biting cold. His boots crunched through the snow as he approached the mound. His breath came out in short, visible puffs. And then he saw it. A dog. It was a golden retriever, its golden fur matted and stiff, its body curled in a tight ball, as if trying to shield itself from the merciless storm. Its eyes were closed, its limbs frozen in place. There was no sign of life. It was hard to tell how old the dog was, probably around 2 or 3 years old. Beneath the frost and ice, it must have once been a beautiful creature, with a coat of rich golden hues, now dulled by ice and dirt. Its paws were cracked from exposure, and its nose was dry. A collar had once circled its neck, but it was gone now, lost or taken. Daniel knelt beside the frozen animal, his gloved hands hesitating above its motionless body. His chest tightened. He had seen animals in bad shape before. He had found dogs on the brink of death, saved strays from drowning, and pulled battered creatures from the wreckage of cruel neglect. But this was different. This dog was gone. The rational part of him said there was nothing more to be done. The body had been out here too long, the cold having stolen every last trace of warmth. But the other part of him, the part that had once been a rescuer, couldn't just leave it here. Daniel exhaled sharply and ran a hand over his face. "This is stupid," he muttered, but still he moved. With careful hands, he brushed snow from the dog's body and pulled a thick woolen blanket from his truck. He wrapped the stiff form as gently as he could, lifting it into his arms. It was like carrying a block of ice, the weight of something that once had life, now reduced to stillness. Daniel placed the dog in the back seat, shutting the door with a quiet finality. He wasn't sure why he was doing this. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was old instincts refusing to die. Or maybe deep down some part of him still believed in miracles. The truck rumbled back onto the road, pushing through the blizzard as Daniel stole glances at the motionless form in his rearview mirror. He wasn't sure what he'd do when he got home. Maybe he'd call the vet in the morning, though there was no rush for a dog that was already dead. Maybe he'd bury it in his backyard, where at least it wouldn't be left to rot beneath the snow. The thought made his stomach twist. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the snow had coated his windshield in a thick blur. He cut the engine and sat in silence for a moment, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. Lily was waiting inside. Lily was 10 years old, a small, wiry girl with freckles splashed across her nose and wild, dark curls that her mother used to braid every night. She had inherited Claire's kind eyes and stubborn heart, both a blessing and a challenge. Since her mother's passing, Lily had grown quieter. She still smiled, still laughed, but there was a sadness that never truly left her. And yet she carried a boundless love for animals, just like her father once did. When Daniel stepped through the door, stomping the snow from his boots, Lily ran up to greet him. "You're late," she said, crossing her arms. "Storm slowed me down," he replied, brushing the snow from his jacket. Lily peered past him and frowned. "What's in the truck?" Daniel hesitated. "A dog." Lily's eyes widened. "A dog? Can I see?" Daniel sighed. "Lily, it's not what you think. The dog didn't make it." Lily's expression faltered. But then she straightened her shoulders, determination flickering in her young eyes. "Can I at least say goodbye?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He had never been able to say no to her when she looked at him like that. "All right, but be careful." The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes as Daniel crouched beside the lifeless body of the dog, a heavy shovel in one hand. Snowflakes danced wildly in the air, swirling around them like tiny frozen ghosts. The storm had not relented, and neither had the sinking weight in Daniel's chest. The dog had been gone too long, its body stiff, its fur crusted with ice, its eyes shut as if surrendering to the cold. It was a tragic end, but he had seen worse in his years as an animal rescuer. Sometimes there was nothing left to do except ensure a creature received some dignity in its final rest. Lily stood beside him, small and shivering, her breath visible in the freezing night air. She had barely spoken since Daniel told her what they had to do. Her lips were set in a firm line, her dark curls peeking from beneath the hood of her oversized coat, her mother's coat. She refused to let go of it, no matter how big it was on her. Claire had always been the one to comfort her, and now it seemed that the old fabric was the closest thing Lily had left to her warmth. Daniel sighed and adjusted his grip on the shovel. He didn't want Lily to watch this. "Go inside, sweetheart. It's too cold for you out here." Lily's voice was quiet but firm. No, he deserves for someone to say goodbye. Daniel looked at her, seeing so much of Claire in her quiet stubbornness, her fierce kindness. He nodded. Together they began to dig through the frozen earth, their breaths coming in sharp, visible puffs against the cold night air. Then it happened, a sound, soft, almost imperceptible. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. His gaze snapped toward the dog's still form, his heart hammering. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Perhaps it had been his imagination, some cruel trick of the wind. And then a tremor ran through the dog's body, a shallow, fragile breath. Lily gasped, stumbling forward. "Dad, he's alive!" Daniel didn't hesitate. The shovel clattered into the snow as he dropped to his knees, pressing his fingers against the dog's side. There, beneath layers of matted fur, he felt it, faint but undeniable. A heartbeat, impossible. No animal should have survived being frozen solid like that. It defied every biological law he had ever known. And yet, here it was, weak but persistent, a miracle buried beneath ice. Daniel scooped the dog into his arms, his muscles tensing against its dead weight. "Inside, now." Lily ran ahead, pushing open the front door as Daniel barreled inside, kicking the door shut behind them. The warmth of the house was immediate, but it wasn't enough. The dog was still dangerously cold, its body rigid, its breathing barely there. Daniel rushed to the fireplace, kneeling as he laid the dog down on a thick pile of blankets. The fire crackled and spat embers into the air, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Lily hovered nearby, her small hands clenched into fists. What do we do? Daniel didn't have an answer. He had revived dogs before. Dogs on the brink, dogs pulled from frozen lakes, dogs beaten and broken, but never one that had been this far gone. He worked on instinct, rubbing the dog's body, trying to stimulate circulation. The fur was still damp, stiff from frost. He grabbed a towel, rubbing the dog down with firm, quick motions. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Don't give up on me now." Lily disappeared and returned moments later, a thick woolen blanket in her arms. She draped it over the dog carefully, then crouched beside Daniel, her face full of determination. "What if we call the vet?" Daniel shook his head. "The roads are too bad. No one's getting here tonight." He hesitated. "And I don't think a vet can do more than we're doing now." Lily frowned but didn't argue. Instead, she reached out and placed a small, gentle hand on the dog's head. "He needs a name." Daniel blinked at her. "Lily, we have to believe he'll live. He needs a name." Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. His fingers were still stiff from the cold. He looked down at the dog, at the fragile rise and fall of its chest, at the quiet fight for life it was somehow still waging. Lily's voice was softer now, barely above a whisper. "Hope." Daniel exhaled slowly. Hope. It wasn't just a name. It was a belief, a fragile thing held together by faith and desperation. Daniel had lost faith in a lot of things over the years. He had stopped hoping for anything after Claire died. But now, looking at this dog, frozen yet still breathing, something flickered in him. Maybe, just maybe, hope wasn't dead after all. The night stretched on in an agonizing crawl. The storm outside showed no sign of relenting, the wind wailing like a living thing. Daniel and Lily took turns sitting beside Hope, monitoring every shallow breath, every twitch of its paws. At one point, Daniel stepped away to get coffee, rubbing exhaustion from his eyes. When he returned, he found Lily curled up on the rug beside Hope, her head resting lightly against the dog's side. For a moment, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. He had almost forgotten what it felt like, to see her so at peace, so unburdened by grief. Claire had always been the one to soothe her nightmares, to wipe away her tears. Since she was gone, Lily had grown quieter, more withdrawn. But tonight, as she lay beside Hope, her breathing slow and steady, she looked like a child again. Daniel sat beside her, careful not to wake her. His gaze flickered back to Hope. There was still so much they didn't know. How had the dog survived? Where had it come from? Was there someone out there searching for it, or had it been abandoned? He let out a quiet sigh, rubbing a hand over his tired face. Tomorrow he would try to find some answers, but for now all he could do was wait and hope. The snow had begun to settle, its relentless fury from the storm now reduced to a gentle drift against the window panes. The town, though still buried under thick layers of ice, had started to breathe again, emerging slowly from the frozen silence that had gripped it for days. Inside the small, dimly lit house, warmth flickered in the hearth, casting long, wavering shadows across the wooden floors. Hope lay curled up near the fire, his golden fur now soft and dry, his breathing steady. He had survived the impossible, but Daniel couldn't shake the gnawing unease at the back of his mind. Something about Hope wasn't normal. The dog had come back from the brink of death, and now as the days passed, he was growing stronger at a rate that didn't quite make sense. His once limp body now moved with growing ease, and though his ribs still pressed against his skin, it was as if his body was rapidly working to rebuild itself. It wasn't just his resilience that unsettled Daniel. It was the scar. One evening, as he sat beside Hope, running his fingers gently along the dog's thick fur, his hand brushed against something uneven near Hope's front leg. A faint ridge of tissue, long since healed, but unmistakable, a scar. Daniel's brow furrowed. It wasn't the kind of mark a stray would pick up from scavenging or running through the woods. This was surgical. Someone had once taken care of this dog, someone who had loved him. A second discovery followed. As Daniel adjusted Hope's fur, his fingers traced a subtle indentation around the dog's neck. There, beneath the dense coat, was the unmistakable sign of a collar that had once been worn for a long time, but had been removed. Hope hadn't always been a stray, he had once belonged to someone. Daniel sat back, staring at the dog, who looked up at him with those intelligent, deep brown eyes. "Who were you?" he murmured. Lily, who had been sitting nearby with her knees tucked to her chest, watching Hope with quiet affection, perked up. "Maybe we can find out," she said. Daniel met her gaze, seeing the curiosity burning behind her soft brown eyes, the same curiosity that had once led Claire to adopt every injured bird, every abandoned kitten, every lost soul that had crossed her path. He sighed. "We can try," he said, "but we have to be prepared for what we might find." The next morning, Daniel made the call. He stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, his fingers drumming absently as the phone rang. The voice on the other end answered with a familiar gruffness. "Dr. Whitaker, Pinebrook Veterinary Clinic. Who's calling?" Daniel hadn't spoken to Dr. James Whitaker in years, not since he left his old life behind. The veterinarian had been an old-school, no-nonsense man in his late 50s, tall and built like a lumberjack, with sharp blue eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty to tolerate fools. He had a deep, gravelly voice, the kind that made you stand up straighter when he spoke, and a reputation for being brutally honest. "It's Daniel Carter," he said. A pause, then a huff of amusement. "Well, I'll be damned, thought you disappeared." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, well, life happened." "That it did," Whitaker said. "So what brings you back to my doorstep?" Daniel glanced at Hope, who was lying by the fireplace, gnawing lazily on a piece of cloth Lily had sacrificed to him. "I found a dog," he said. "Golden retriever. Looks like he had an owner before. There's a scar on his front leg, possibly from surgery, and signs that he used to wear a collar." There was a pause. Then Whitaker's tone shifted, growing more serious. "You say a golden retriever with a surgical scar?" "Yeah," Daniel said slowly. "Why?" "Give me a second." The line went quiet, and Daniel could hear the faint rustling of papers in the background, the clicking of a keyboard. When Whitaker came back, his voice had a different weight to it. "I think I might know the dog you're talking about." Daniel straightened. "Go on." "A year ago," Whitaker said, "there was an accident just outside of town. A bus crash. There was a woman and her kid on board, and from what I remember, they had a golden retriever with them. The wreck was bad. Kid got hurt and the mother was in bad shape. The dog went missing after the crash. I assumed it had died." Daniel felt a chill creep up his spine. "You're saying this dog disappeared a year ago?" "More than a year, actually," Whitaker said. "If it's the same dog, then I don't know how the hell he's still alive." Daniel swallowed. "Who was the owner?" Whitaker sighed. "Her name was Sarah Nolan. She was just passing through town when it happened. After the crash, she stayed for a few weeks while her son was in the hospital. But when she realized the dog was gone, she finally left. Said she couldn't stay in a place where she'd lost too much. I doubt she ever thought the dog could still be alive." Daniel hung up the phone, his mind racing. A bus crash, a child, a mother who had lost hope. It all fit together, but it left one gaping question. How had Hope survived an entire year in the wilderness, through brutal winters, without starving, without being attacked? Lily sat at the kitchen table, watching him with quiet patience. "Did you find anything?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Hope had a family." Lily's eyes widened. "So, do we give him back?" Daniel ran a hand down his face. That was the question, wasn't it? Before he could answer, a warm weight pressed against his leg. Hope had gotten up, moving closer, his deep brown eyes looking up at him with something almost knowing. For the first time since finding him, Daniel felt it, the unshakable feeling that this dog hadn't just survived by chance. Somehow, against all odds, Hope had found his way back. Daniel sat in the dim light of his kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold between his hands, staring at the worn wooden table as if the answer to the mystery lay hidden in its grain. The fire in the living room crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls, but he hardly noticed. His thoughts were tangled in the growing enigma of Hope, this dog that had defied death, that had survived an impossible year in the wilderness, and that now seemed to be pulling him towards something he couldn't yet understand. The more Daniel dug into Hope's past, the more unsettling the story became. Dr. Whitaker's revelation about the bus crash had given him a name, Sarah Nolan, but there was still something missing. The details didn't add up. How had a family dog, cherished and well cared for, ended up in such a dire situation? What had truly happened the night Hope vanished? The weight of these questions gnawed at him as he reached for his phone, his fingers hesitating before dialing a number he hadn't used in years. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, rough and skeptical. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again, Carter." Daniel exhaled. Detective Mark Grayson. Mark had been a friend once, back when Daniel was still working in animal rescue. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow and an expression that always seemed one step away from either irritation or exhaustion. His voice was low and gravelly, the kind of voice that carried weight, that made people listen. Mark had spent his career in law enforcement, first as a beat cop, then as a detective in missing persons, a job that had slowly chipped away at the idealism he once carried. He wasn't a man who wasted words. "Mark," Daniel said, leaning against the counter, "I need a favor." A pause, then a quiet chuckle. "A favor? That's new. Last I checked, you were done with all this." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, well, something came up." Mark's tone shifted. "Go on." Daniel told him everything. The dog, the scars, the missing collar, the bus crash, and Sarah Nolan. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Mark spoke, his voice slower now, careful. "You said the dog belonged to Sarah's family." "That's what I was told." "Then you don't have the whole story." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then Mark exhaled. "This isn't just about Sarah Nolan. The dog didn't originally belong to her." Something in Daniel's chest tightened. "Then who?" A beat passed. Then Mark said a name that made Daniel's stomach drop. "Ethan Davis." Daniel didn't realize he was holding his breath until the name settled in the air around him. He knew that name. Everyone in his line of work had known that name. Ethan Davis had been one of those cases that stayed with you, one of those tragedies that even time couldn't erase. A young boy, no older than 9, diagnosed with a rare degenerative disease that had slowly stolen his ability to walk, to run, to live the way a child should. His mother, a single parent, had done everything to give him the best life possible, and in the middle of all of it, there had been a dog, Hope. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "That's not possible." "Oh, it's possible," Mark said. Hope was Ethan's service dog, trained to help him through the worst of it. But after Ethan passed away, his mother couldn't bear to keep the dog. She gave him to a new family. That family was the Nolans. Daniel felt a weight settle on his chest. Hope had belonged to Ethan, a dog trained to be his lifeline, his guardian, his friend. And yet, on the night Ethan died, Hope had disappeared. "Do you remember the storm that night?" Mark continued. "Worst blizzard we had that year. The kid passed away in the hospital, and a few hours later the dog was just gone. No one saw him leave. No one knew how he got out." Daniel's eyes flickered to Hope, who was lying curled by the fireplace, his golden fur reflecting the warm glow of the flames. It didn't make sense. A well-trained service dog wouldn't just run away. Not unless it had been looking for someone. Daniel's stomach twisted. Unless it had been trying to find Ethan. The house was silent, except for the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of Lily breathing as she slept on the couch, wrapped in an old quilt. Hope stirred in his sleep, his paws twitching slightly, as if running through a dream. Daniel sat on the floor beside him, his thoughts racing. The logical part of him, the part that had always clung to reason, told him that a dog couldn't understand death in the way humans did, that Hope couldn't have gone searching for a boy who was no longer in this world. But something about this dog, about the way he had survived against all odds, made Daniel question everything he thought he knew. What if Hope hadn't run away? What if he had been called? Daniel swallowed hard, his mind drifting to something he had seen earlier that evening, while Lily had been brushing Hope's fur. She had whispered something to him, soft and playful, a moment of warmth between a child and a dog. And in that moment, Hope had looked up, his eyes fixated not on Lily but at something behind her, something Daniel couldn't see. Just for a split second, Daniel could have sworn he saw Hope's ears perk, his body tense, not in fear, but in recognition, as if he were waiting for someone. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. He didn't know what to believe anymore. But what he did know was this: Hope was no ordinary dog. And whatever had brought him back after all this time, whatever had led him through an impossible winter to survive when no other creature could, was something far greater than chance. Tomorrow he would dig deeper. He had to, because the more he uncovered, the more he realized this wasn't just about a lost dog. This was about something bigger, something buried beneath the ice, beneath the past. And he had a feeling that once he uncovered it, there would be no turning back. The house was quiet, save for the gentle crackle of embers in the fireplace. Outside, the wind had settled, and the thick layers of snow blanketing the town shimmered under the pale glow of the moon. It was the kind of night that should have been peaceful, yet something felt off, an unspoken tension lingering in the air, wrapping around the walls like an unseen force. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring into the dark liquid of his untouched coffee. Sleep had been elusive, his mind tangled in the puzzle that was Hope. The dog had survived an impossible year in the wilderness, had belonged to a boy who was now gone, and had somehow found his way back, not to his original home, not to the family that had once cared for him, but here, to Daniel and Lily. Why? His gaze shifted to the living room, where Lily lay curled up on the couch, her small body rising and falling in the rhythm of deep sleep. At her feet, Hope was awake. The golden retriever sat upright, ears perked, his gaze fixated on the window. He wasn't watching the snow or listening for sounds outside. He was staring at the sky. This wasn't the first time. Over the past few nights, Lily had told Daniel something that unsettled him. Every night, Dad, he looks up like he's waiting for someone, and sometimes he makes this soft sound like he's calling out. Daniel had shrugged it off at first. Maybe it was a habit Hope had picked up while surviving in the wild. Maybe he was just listening to the wind. But now, as he watched the dog sit perfectly still, his eyes reflecting the moonlight, Daniel felt something in his gut, a deep, unshakable instinct that something wasn't right. He set his coffee down and walked towards the window. The floor creaked beneath his weight. Hope didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. His ears twitched slightly, but his focus never wavered. Daniel followed his gaze. The sky was clear, the kind of crystalline winter night where stars scattered like shattered glass. It was beautiful, but there was nothing unusual. And yet Hope stared, as if he saw something that Daniel couldn't. The hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stood on end. A deep unease settled in his chest, but exhaustion finally won. With a final glance at the dog, he ruffled Hope's fur and turned toward his bedroom. That night he dreamed. It was the kind of dream that felt too real. Daniel stood in a vast, snow-covered field, the wind whispering through the trees. The sky was an endless stretch of white, as if the world had stopped, silent, frozen in time. He felt the crunch of snow beneath his boots as he took a cautious step forward, his breath visible in the cold air. And then he saw them, a boy and a dog, Ethan. He was small, no older than 9 or 10, with a frail frame and pale skin. His brown hair curled slightly at the ends, and his face was familiar. Daniel had seen it before in news articles, in photographs of the sickly child who had spent his final years confined to a hospital bed. But here, in this dream, he wasn't sick. He stood tall, dressed in a simple blue hoodie and jeans, smiling. And at his side, there was Hope. Daniel's breath caught. No, not Hope. A dog identical to Hope. They stood together in the snow, Ethan's small hand resting on the retriever's head. Daniel tried to move forward, to speak, but the cold air stole his voice. Ethan lifted his head, his eyes meeting Daniel's. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and pointed. Daniel followed the direction of his finger. Beyond the open field at the edge of the dream's landscape, there was a dense, dark forest. A familiar one. The same forest where Daniel had found Hope buried in the snow. Daniel turned back to Ethan, his heart pounding. The boy's expression never changed. He simply smiled, his eyes full of something Daniel couldn't quite name, understanding maybe, or knowing. Then the world began to blur, the snow dissolving into mist, the shapes fading, and Daniel woke up. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, his body tangled in damp sheets. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight through the curtains. A dream. Just a dream. He rubbed his hands over his face, his pulse still racing, but as he sat up trying to steady himself, something caught his attention. A shadow near the door. Daniel turned his head sharply. Hope was sitting there, still as stone, watching him. His golden fur shimmered faintly in the dim light, his deep brown eyes unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel exhaled, his heartbeat slowing. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a quiet, uneasy laugh. You saw it too, didn't you? Hope didn't react, but Daniel already knew the answer. The next morning, he didn't hesitate. The dream had been a sign. He was sure of it. Even if his rational mind fought against the idea, his instincts told him otherwise. He bundled up, pulling on his thickest coat, lacing his boots. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in untouched white. The air was sharp and crisp, the sky clear. Lily sat at the kitchen table, watching him with curiosity. Where are you going? Daniel hesitated. He could lie, tell her it was nothing, but Lily had always been perceptive, just like her mother. To the woods, he finally admitted. I need to check something. Lily frowned. Why? Daniel hesitated. Then, before he could stop himself, he said, Because I think Hope wants me to. Lily blinked, surprised, but then she looked at the dog, and something in her face shifted. She understood. She always did. The path through the woods was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of Daniel's boots against the frozen ground. Hope trotted beside him, his movements calm but purposeful. It was as if he knew exactly where they were going. Daniel followed. The deeper they went, the more uneasy Daniel felt. This place had a presence, something just out of reach, lingering between the trees. He remembered the moment he had first found Hope here, buried beneath layers of ice and snow, a creature that should have been long gone. And then Hope stopped, his ears twitched, his nose lifted to the air, and then he began to dig. Daniel's stomach tightened as he crouched down, brushing away the loose snow. Hope's paws moved with urgency, as if he had known this place all along, as if he had been here before. And then, beneath the snow, something hard appeared. Daniel's breath hitched as he reached down and pulled it free, a collar, faded, worn, buried for who knew how long, but the name was still clear. Ethan. Daniel stared at it, the weight of it heavy in his hand, the realization sinking deep into his bones. This wasn't over, not even close. Daniel stood in the frozen silence of the woods, his breath coming out in short, visible puffs as he stared at the collar in his hands. The name Ethan was still visible on the worn leather, though the edges had cracked with time, the metal buckle dulled by months, maybe even a full year, buried beneath the snow. His fingers tightened around it, a cold weight settling in his stomach. This was proof. Hope had not simply been lost. He had not run away. Someone had brought him here. Someone had left him here. A shiver ran down Daniel's spine, and this time it had nothing to do with the cold. Hope sat beside him, watching with quiet patience, his deep brown eyes unreadable. The dog had led him here, as if guiding him toward something he had always known, but had never been able to reveal. Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had spent years working in animal rescue. He had seen cases of neglect, of cruelty, of abandonment. He had seen people throw away pets like old furniture, discarding them without a second thought. But this was different. Someone had wanted Hope gone, and now Daniel needed to find out who. The drive back to town was quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of the tires rolling over packed snow. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter than he needed to, his jaw clenched. His thoughts kept circling back to Ethan, the sick little boy, the boy whose last companion in life had been this very dog. If Hope had been left in the woods, who had done it? Ethan's mother, Sarah, had stayed in town for a while after his passing, grieving her loss, hoping to find hope before finally giving up and moving away. That meant it hadn't been her, which left only one other possibility: Frank Ellis. Frank Ellis. Frank had entered Sarah and Ethan's life 2 years before Ethan's death. He had been a big, heavy-set man, the kind who took up space in a room without saying much. His hair had started thinning early, and his deep-set grey eyes always seemed to carry a tired impatience, like the weight of the world was just one inconvenience too many for him to handle. He had worked as a construction foreman, a man of strict discipline who believed in order and practicality, but he had never been Ethan's father. Daniel remembered hearing about him back when he was still working in rescue. The rumors had always been there. Frank was distant, barely involved in Ethan's care. He had married Sarah, but he had never truly accepted the boy as his own. And now Daniel knew. Frank had been the one who abandoned Hope. The truth burned in his chest like a slow-growing fire. Hope hadn't been lost in the blizzard. He had been left to die in it. Daniel clenched his fists. He needed to find Frank. It took some digging, but Daniel finally tracked him down. Frank had stayed in town after Sarah left, continuing his job at a local construction company. He lived alone in a run-down house on the outskirts of town, near an old gas station where trucks passed through on their way to the city. The place was unremarkable, the kind of home that looked like a man had built it out of duty rather than care. Daniel parked outside and took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what he was going to say. He just knew that he needed answers. He knocked, a long pause. Then heavy footsteps thudded toward the door. Frank opened it, and the years had not been kind to him. His gut had grown, his face had deepened with lines of exhaustion, and his eyes, those cold grey eyes, looked even emptier than Daniel remembered. He squinted, his brows knitting together. "What do you want?" Daniel didn't waste time. He held up the collar. "This belonged to Ethan's dog." Frank's gaze flickered to the collar, then to Daniel's face. For a moment there was nothing, just blank indifference. Then something dark shifted in Frank's expression, a flicker of recognition, of guilt. He knew. Daniel's grip tightened. "You left him in the woods, didn't you?" Frank didn't answer. He turned away, stepping back into the house, but Daniel pushed forward, slamming the door open with his shoulder. Frank's voice turned sharp. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daniel took another step inside, his presence unshakable. "Yes, you do. You took Hope. You drove him into the woods in the middle of a storm, and you left him there. Why?" Frank exhaled harshly, rubbing a hand over his face. "Sarah was a mess after Ethan died," he muttered, his voice rough. "She couldn't function, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. And that damn dog," he shook his head, "he wouldn't stop looking for the kid, every night howling, scratching at Ethan's door, like he didn't understand that the boy was gone." Daniel's stomach twisted. Frank's voice grew lower. "Sarah wasn't moving on. She wasn't letting go. That dog, he was just keeping her trapped in the past. So, yeah," he let out a bitter chuckle. "I got rid of him. I took him far enough that he wouldn't come back. I thought it was the kindest thing to do." Daniel took a slow, steady breath, his fists curling. "You left him to die." Frank's jaw clenched, his gaze hard. "It was a dog. No, Daniel said, his voice like steel. He was Ethan's dog, and he still found his way back. For the first time, something flickered in Frank's expression, something like doubt. Daniel took a step back. He survived a year in the wild, through storms, through starvation, and after all that, he still found a way home. His voice dropped. You couldn't kill him. Frank's face paled. Daniel turned without another word, stepping out into the cold. Hope was waiting for him by the truck, tail low, ears perked, watching. As Daniel approached, he knelt beside the dog, running a hand over his thick fur. I'm sorry, buddy, he murmured. You never should have gone through that. Hope leaned into him, pressing his warm body against Daniel's side. And then a single thought echoed in Daniel's mind. How did he survive? A dog, even a strong one like Hope, shouldn't have lasted a year alone in these brutal conditions. There had to be more to the story. Something, or someone, had kept him alive. Daniel's grip on Hope's fur tightened. He had solved one mystery, but the biggest question still remained. How had Hope survived the impossible? And why did Daniel have the feeling that the answer would change everything? The wind had softened into a quiet whisper, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke as the town slowly awoke beneath the thick blanket of snow. It had been days since Daniel had confronted Frank, since the weight of the truth had finally come to light. But the heaviness in his chest hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown. The knowledge of Hope's suffering, of how he had been discarded like something meaningless, sat bitterly in Daniel's mind. But there was something else, too. Awe. Hope had defied the odds. He had survived when logic said he shouldn't have, and Daniel wasn't the only one who felt it. Lily had been spending every waking moment with Hope, her small fingers buried in his thick fur, whispering to him like they shared some unspoken language. She had always had a deep love for animals, but with Hope, it was different. She had become protective, as if she understood, even at her young age, that this dog had been through something extraordinary. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lily looked up at Daniel with those big, knowing eyes of hers. We have to keep him, she said simply. Daniel hesitated. He had been thinking the same thing, but Hope wasn't just any dog. He belonged to someone once, someone who had suffered a terrible loss. Someone who had never stopped missing him. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Lily? But she shook her head before he could say another word. He came back for us, she said softly. He chose us. Daniel let out a slow breath, glancing at Hope, who lay curled at Lily's feet, his eyes half closed but still watching, always watching. He thought about the past year. The storms, the freezing nights, the hunger Hope must have endured, and yet he had survived, not just by chance, but by something else, something deeper, something neither of them understood. Finally, Daniel nodded. Okay, he said, we'll keep him. Lily's face lit up, and Hope's tail thumped softly against the wooden floor, as if he had understood every word. For the first time in a long time, their house didn't feel empty. The next morning, the news came. Daniel was halfway through fixing a broken cabinet hinge when his phone rang. He barely glanced at it before answering, pressing it to his ear with his free hand. Yeah? A pause, then a familiar voice. Daniel? Daniel froze. It had been years since he had heard that voice. Soft, careful, but carrying an undercurrent of something raw, something broken. Sarah Nolan. Sarah had always been the kind of woman who carried both strength and sorrow in equal measure. Tall and willowy, with long auburn hair that she never quite had the energy to keep neat. She had once been full of quiet warmth, the kind of mother who read bedtime stories with soft voices and sat up all night by hospital beds without complaint. But after Ethan's death, something inside her had fractured. She had left town not because she wanted to, but because staying was unbearable. Now, years later, she had returned. I'm at the cemetery, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I came to visit Ethan. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. I heard you were back. Sarah hesitated. There's something else. Daniel frowned. What is it? Another pause, then, almost disbelievingly, she said, "I saw him, Daniel. I saw Hope." Daniel drove to the cemetery, the roads slick from melted snow, refreezing under the morning frost. His hands were tight on the steering wheel, his heartbeat oddly steady despite the storm raging inside him. He wasn't sure how this was going to go. When he pulled up, he saw her immediately. Sarah stood near the gravestone, wrapped in a dark coat too thin for the weather, her arms hugging herself tightly. Her face was older, more worn than he remembered, lines of grief carved permanently into her features. She had once been vibrant, full of quiet determination, but now she looked like someone who had lived through too many winters, each one taking a little more from her. And yet, when she turned to face him, there was something else there too. Something wide-eyed and raw. Hope sat beside her. She was trembling. Daniel got out of the truck, his boots crunching over the snow. "Sarah." She shook her head, tears slipping down her face. "It can't be him." Her voice broke. "It just can't." Daniel swallowed. "It's him." Sarah let out a small, breathless laugh, disbelieving, overwhelmed. "But how?" Her hands hovered over Hope's face, as if she was afraid that touching him would make him vanish like a dream. "I thought he was gone. I thought he—" She swallowed hard. "I searched for him. I called his name for weeks, but he never came back." Daniel took a slow breath. "He tried." Sarah's tear-filled eyes snapped to his. Daniel exhaled. "Frank took him." For a moment she didn't move, didn't breathe. Then a slow, dawning horror spread across her face. "No," she whispered. Daniel clenched his jaw. He admitted it, said he thought keeping Hope would make it harder for you to move on. His voice darkened. "So he dumped him in the woods, in the middle of a blizzard." Sarah staggered back, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Her entire body shook, rage and heartbreak colliding in a storm behind her eyes. "He left him?" Her voice rose, cracking with emotion. "He left him to die?" Daniel looked away. "Yeah." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, a strangled sob escaping. Hope whined, his ears lowering as he nudged her leg, sensing the grief radiating from her. She looked down at him, her breath shaking, her tears falling freely now. Then, without hesitation, she fell to her knees and wrapped her arms around him. Hope didn't flinch. He melted into her, pressing his body against hers, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. Sarah buried her face in his fur, her shoulders shaking. "You came back," she whispered. "You found me." Hope let out a deep, content sigh. Daniel stood there, watching, unable to look away. Then Sarah lifted her face, tears shining in her eyes, and said the words that sent a chill through Daniel's very soul. "He's not just a dog." Her fingers trembled as she stroked Hope's fur, reverent, awed. "He's Ethan's soul." Daniel swallowed hard, something unsettling and powerful twisting in his chest. Sarah let out a breathless, broken laugh, her fingers curling into Hope's fur, like she was holding on to something beyond this world. "He came back to find me," she whispered. "He came back, because he knew I still needed him." Daniel felt the weight of her words settle into his bones, because deep down in some part of him that he couldn't explain, he believed it too. Hope hadn't just survived. He had returned, and Daniel had a feeling that the story wasn't over yet, not even close. The sky had begun its slow shift into evening, painting the town in muted hues of amber and blue. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the heavens, catching the glow of streetlights, blanketing the world in quiet stillness. Inside Daniel's home, the warmth of the fireplace crackled through the air, the scent of burning wood mixing with the faint aroma of cocoa from Lily's half-finished mug on the coffee table. Hope lay curled at Lily's feet, his golden fur illuminated by the flickering firelight, his body rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. It was the first time in a long while that everything felt settled, but Daniel knew it wouldn't last. Sarah stood near the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at Hope with an expression Daniel couldn't quite place. Grief, longing, gratitude, something else entirely. She had barely taken her eyes off him since their reunion at the cemetery, and now came the moment Daniel had been dreading. Sarah let out a slow breath before speaking. "I think it's time I take him home." Lily's head snapped up. "No." The sharpness in her voice startled even herself. She scrambled up from the couch, placing herself between Sarah and Hope, her small hands clenched at her sides. "He belongs here. He wants to stay." Sarah's expression softened, but there was something conflicted in her gaze. "Sweetheart, I know you love him, but he was my son's dog. I lost both of them, and now, by some miracle, I have a chance to get part of Ethan back." Lily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "He's not a part of Ethan," she said fiercely. "He's Hope, and Hope chooses where he belongs." Sarah hesitated, then crouched down, extending a hand toward Hope. "Come here, boy." For a moment, the room held its breath. Hope lifted his head, ears flicking, eyes shifting between Sarah and Lily. Then he didn't move. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly, her breath catching. She tried again, patting her knees gently, her voice soft. "Come on, Hope. Let's go home." But Hope didn't budge. Instead, he turned, resting his head against Lily's leg. Daniel exhaled, his chest tightening. Sarah's face crumpled, a soft sob escaping her lips. She wiped at her eyes quickly, as if embarrassed by her own reaction, before letting out a broken laugh. "He's choosing you." Lily wrapped her arms around Hope's neck, burying her face into his fur, relief washing over her in waves. Daniel took a step forward, resting a careful hand on Sarah's shoulder. "He's found his family," he said gently. Sarah swallowed hard, looking away for a moment. Then, after a long silence, she nodded. "I think I always knew," she admitted quietly, "from the moment I saw him again." She let out a shaky breath, standing to her feet. "It's just, letting go is harder than I thought." Daniel understood that feeling far too well. Sarah looked down at Hope, offering him a watery smile. "Take care of them, okay?" Hope let out a soft chuff, as if in understanding. Sarah lingered for another moment, but then she turned, stepping toward the door. Just before she walked out, she whispered, "Merry Christmas." That night, snow fell heavier than before, but it wasn't the kind that brought bitter cold or biting wind. It was soft, gentle, the kind that made the world feel quiet and safe. Inside the house, the fire crackled, wrapping the room in golden warmth. Daniel sat in his chair, Lily curled up beside Hope on the rug, her fingers gently brushing through his thick fur. She had barely let go of him since Sarah left, as if afraid he might disappear the moment she did. Outside the window, Christmas lights flickered across the street, the faint sound of holiday music carrying through the air. Daniel took a sip of his coffee, watching as Lily slowly drifted into sleep. He felt something settle deep inside him, something that had been restless for years. This was what home was supposed to feel like. Hope lifted his head, his eyes catching the light of the fire, and for a moment Daniel swore he saw something there, something beyond just a dog. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Hope turned his gaze toward the window. Daniel followed his line of sight. The night sky stretched endlessly beyond the glass, the stars glimmering like distant lanterns. Hope's ears perked slightly, his expression unreadable, and then, ever so gently, his tail wagged once. Daniel's breath caught. It was like Hope was saying goodbye. To who, Daniel didn't know. To Ethan, to the past, to the part of himself that had been waiting for something only he could understand. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand down Hope's back. Some things would never have answers. Some things weren't meant to be understood, only felt. Lily murmured in her sleep, pressing closer to Hope, and Daniel smiled. He looked back out the window, watching as the snow fell quietly over the town, over the trees, over the road that had once led Hope to them. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "There are things in this world we'll never be able to explain, and there are some loves that never fade, even when buried beneath the coldest of winters." The fire crackled softly, and Hope lay his head down, letting out a long, content sigh. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the room wrapping around him like a long-lost embrace. Finally, after everything, they were home.